Good afternoon and welcome everybody. We're going to get started. Can you guys hear me? Or am I not talking very loud? Oh, that's not, you can hear me? Okay, good. My name is Deborah Gonzalez and I'm the Government Affairs Director here at the Public Policy Institute of California, or PPIC. And thank you for joining us. It appears to be the first week of summer and we just went from winter to summer. So it's very confusing for me, especially as somebody who rides their bike to work. For those of you not familiar with PPIC, we're a nonpartisan nonprofit with offices both in San Francisco and Sacramento. And for today's program, we're going to learn the findings of PPIC's annual statewide survey on Californians and education. This survey was supported with funding from the Dirk and Charlene Capstanel Foundation, the S.D. Bechtel Jr. Foundation, and the Stewart Foundation, and we'd like to thank them for their support of this important work. We'd like to also acknowledge the PPIC Corporate Circle and the PPIC Donor Circle for their support of this event and today's launch. At registration, you should have received the documents with the key findings, the full survey, the slides you're going to see, and the key findings are all online now for your information. After the presentation, we'll have plenty of time for question and answers. We are recording this, so please wait for the microphone to come so the audience can hear your question. And a couple things before we begin. We have another event here next week. It's on English as a second language in the California community colleges. Sign-ups are now available. And later today, you'll receive a survey from our survey team. So they're going to look you in the eye, and they're going to ask you to respond on whether you find these events helpful or not. And please turn off your cell phones. K through 12 education has been in the news and a subject of a large number of bills in the legislature this year. A large number there's probably, Sophia's here, probably 500 to 1,000 bills. I can't believe Sophia was able to get over here for that. And perhaps it's not too surprising. The primary election between Governor Newsom and former LA Mayor Antonio Villaraigosa, the general election race for superintendent, and the recent strikes in LA and Oakland have raised the profile. Oh, and let us not forget, here in Sacramento, there is this discussion of strikes as well. All of these things raise the public awareness of what's happening in public schools. So it's not surprising school funding, charter schools, teacher salaries come top to mind to voters and to Californians in general. This poll, I'm happy to report, is a little longer than most of our polls, and I think Alyssa will speak to that. And I'm very excited as somebody who writes a lot of the background documents and pleads with them to ask my questions. And so I was very happy to see the length and the breadth of some of these questions. I think opponents and proponents of various sides of these issues that are being considered in the legislature will all find something to like and dislike about the poll. So I'm going to let Alyssa go into that. But one thing is clear from the bill: the public believes that education funding needs to be a priority and also understands that a quality education is one of the most effective tools to reduce social inequality. We're not going to tell the legislature or the public on how to deal with that, but we want to make sure that they know that this is a priority for the public. So with that, I'd now like to welcome PPI Research Associate Alyssa Dykman up.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us this very nice and pleasant Thursday afternoon. You can hear me? Great. And thanks again, Deborah. And before we begin, I'd just like to acknowledge the other co-authors of this report. That includes PPIC President and Survey Director, Mark Baldessari, Associate Survey Director, Dean Bonner, who's here with us today, and then fellow Research Associate, Rachel Ward. So as a preview of what we'll be looking at today, I'll first provide some information about PPIC statewide surveys and our methodology for this survey, and then go into the two main sections of the report, which include perceptions and attitudes, and then funding and policy preferences. As Deborah alluded to, we were able to ask a breadth of questions and topics in this survey in particular. Survey topics include things from charter schools to the local control funding formula to teachers, strikes, and salaries. So whether or not you're a K through 12 expert or you know nothing like Jon Snow from Game of Thrones, I'm sure your knowledge will increase from this report. And then just to wrap up, I'll provide some concluding remarks, and then we'll have plenty of time at the end for questions and answers. So the mission of the statewide survey is to provide timely, relevant, nonpartisan data on political, social, and economic opinions that we hope will inform and improve state policymaking, raise awareness, and encourage discussion. Since 1998, we have conducted over 170 general, regional, and issue-specific, such as the K through 12 survey we're talking about today. And through these surveys, we have given a voice to more than 350,000 Californians. And with our surveys, we conduct our surveys with all Californians and then break down our findings into important and relevant subgroups, such as registered voters, likely voters, parents, and public school parents. So as Deborah mentioned, this survey is part of our Californians and Education survey series, of which we're celebrating our 15th annual survey on this topic. Again, I would like to thank the funders for this survey, the Dirk and Charlene Capsonal, the S.D. Bechtel Jr. and Stewart Foundations for their continued support of the survey. So for those who may be familiar with PPIC statewide surveys, you know we have conducted our surveys utilizing live telephone interviewing. However, as the polling world knows, times and survey methods are changing. And staying abreast of these changes while evaluating and incorporating best practices and looking upon our peers, we have updated our polling technique for this survey. And so for this survey, we have conducted our first fully online-only survey using Ipsos, which is a market research firm's knowledge panel, which is a random probability sample that is widely accepted as an alternative to rigorous telephone interviewing. This method has allowed us to delve into more issues in much greater depth than what we do in a live telephone survey, so we're very excited to walk through some of our findings today. So this survey was conducted from April 5th to 15th and was completed by over 1,500 California adult residents. This included 1,289 registered voters and 1,035 who we deemed as likely to vote. This also includes 393 parents of children 18 years or younger and 278 public school parents. The margin of error for all adults was 3.5, for our likely voters 4.0, for our parents 6.6, and for our public school parents 7.8%. And as I mentioned earlier, we have two main sections of the report. The first section looks at attitudes and perceptions, which includes K through 12 education priorities and policies for the new governor, top issues and goals for K through 12 education, California's rankings, grading of local public schools, school teachers, and immigration policy and school safety. The back end is in regards to funding and policy preferences and covers topics such as local school funding, charter schools, and the local control formula, as well as early childhood education. So let's just dive right in to attitudes and perceptions. So with Gavin Newsom in office a little over than 3 months now, how do Californians want the new governor to address K through 12 public education? Today, when asked how much of a priority the state's kindergarten through 12th grade public education system should be for the new governor, 3 in 4 California adults and likely voters say the system should be a high or a very high priority, while fewer than 1 in 10 say it should be a low or very low priority. Among public school parents, 86% say it should be a very high or high priority, so slightly more there. There is notably partisan agreement on this issue, with more than 2 in 3 Democrats, Republicans, and independents saying that the system should be at least a high priority. This sentiment is also shared by at least 7 in 10 across regions and across age, income, and racial and ethnic groups. And then finally, similar shares of Californians said the public higher education system in California should be a high priority for the next governor when we asked this very similar question in our Californians in Higher Education survey this past November. So given that most Californians want K through 12 public education to be a high priority for the new governor, what type of policies would they like to see? When asked if the new governor should generally continue K through 12 policies of his predecessor, Jerry Brown, or mostly change to different policies, we find that majorities of adults and likely voters want Governor Newsom to change to different policies, while about 4 in 10 would want him to continue Jerry Brown's policies. Across parties, majorities of Republicans and independents and less than half of Democrats want to see change, as do majorities across regions. Across racial and ethnic groups, you can see here that majorities want change, with the exception of Latinos, where about half say they want to see the new governor continue Brown's policies, and 4 in 10 say they want change. And finally, among public school parents, we find that they are divided, with 49% preferring change and 45% wanting to continue Brown's policies. Now, when asked to name the most important issue facing California's K through 12 public schools today, California adults and public school parents are most likely to mention the lack of funding. This is followed by large class sizes, concerns about standards and quality of education, limited and poor curriculum, and low teacher pay. Lack of funding is also one of the top mentions across racial and ethnic groups, with a notable 30% of Asian Americans citing this as the most important issue. Across regions, residents of the San Francisco Bay Area and Los Angeles are more likely than those living elsewhere to name lack of funding. And across parties, Democrats and independents are most likely to mention lack of funding, while Republicans equally mention limited and poor curriculum and quality of education. So now that we know what the most important issues are, what do Californians think is the most important goal of K through 12 public schools? Today, we find Californians are divided. A quarter say teaching life skills is the most important goal, while another 24% say preparing students for college. Notably, 44% of public school parents say the most important goal is preparing students for college, so about an 18-point difference between public school parents and all adults on this. Across racial and ethnic groups, Latinos, 42% of them, are likely to say preparing students for college is the most important goal, while with 4 in 10 holding this view, compared to fewer in other racial and ethnic groups. Across partisans, views are divided, with 3 in 10 Democrats citing both preparing students for college and teaching student life skills, 3 in 10 Republicans citing teaching students the basics, and 1 in 4 independents citing teaching students life skills as the most important goal. Now, turning to Californians' perceptions of how their K through 12 public schools rank, first in terms of per pupil spending, and second regarding student test scores. So when it comes to per pupil spending, California ranked 32nd out of the 50 states in expenditures for public K through 12 education per student, according to 2018 data. Today, about 2 in 3 California adults and public school parents say that the state's per pupil spending for K through 12 public schools is average or below average compared to other states. Only about 1 in 4 say that California is either average or above or near the top. Fewer also say that it is near the bottom. Across parties, 2 in 3 Democrats and about 6 in 10 independents and Republicans say that state spending is average or below average, and majorities across racial and ethnic groups and regions also hold this view. Now, turning to student test scores, California ranks below average or near the bottom in English and math test scores for both grades 4 and 8. When asked where California ranks compared to other states, 43% of adults and 31% of public school parents say the state's test scores are below average or near the bottom, while about 4 in 10 say they are average. Across partisans, Republicans are more likely than independents and Democrats to say below average or near the bottom. And among racial and ethnic groups, a majority of African Americans and fewer than less than half, whites, Asian Americans, and Latinos say below average or near the bottom. Across regions, fewer than half say California ranks below average or near the bottom when it comes to student test scores. So given the perceptions of where Californians rank compared to the nation, what grade would Californians give when rating the quality of their local public schools? So today we find 4 in 10 Californians and half of public school parents give their local schools a positive grade of an A or a B. These positive perceptions differ across parties, with nearly half of Democrats giving an A or B, compared to about 1 in 3 Republicans and independents. Across racial and ethnic groups, more than 4 in 10 Asian Americans and about 4 in 10 whites and Latinos and 1 in 5 African Americans have positive perceptions. Regionally, about 4 in 10, except in the Bay Area, which is situated about 1 in 3 residents, give grades of A or B. And compared to a 2018 national poll conducted by PDK and Langer Research Associates, the grades for local public schools nationally are similar to what we found in California. So when asked how their local public schools are doing in preparing students for the future, first in terms of college, 55% of adults and 7 in 10 public school parents give positive ratings, as in either excellent or good. Notably, at least half have rated their schools positively since April of 2013. Today, Orange County and San Diego residents are the most likely, and Bay Area residents are the least likely to rate their schools positively. And across racial and ethnic groups, more than half of whites, Asian Americans, and Latinos give a positive view, whereas about 4 in 10 African Americans say the same. Now, when asked how their local public schools are doing in preparing students for jobs in the workforce, fewer than half of adults and 2 in 3 public school parents express positive opinions. Again, across racial and ethnic groups, African Americans are the least likely to hold a positive view, followed by whites, Asian Americans, and Latinos. Regionally, under half of residents in the Central Valley, Inland Empire, LA, and Bay Area rate their schools positively in this area. Great. Now, turning to a very topical issue, which is the issue of teacher salaries. So teachers across California, especially those in coastal or metropolitan areas, and those at the bottom of the salary scale have been hit quite hard in recent years. Notably, nowhere is the gap between teacher pay and housing costs wider than in the Bay Area, so nearby. And teacher salaries have also been in the news recently, as I'm sure you're aware of, as it relates to striking and protest of higher pay. So today, when asked if salaries for teachers in their community are too high, too low, or just about right, we find that 6 in 10 Californians and public school parents think salaries for teachers in their community are too low. Only about 3 in 10 say salaries are just about right. Democrats are far more likely than Republicans and much more likely than independents to hold this view. And majorities across regions say salaries are too low, with those in the Bay Area and Los Angeles the most likely to express this view. Across racial and ethnic groups, 3 in 4 African Americans, compared to about 6 in 10 Asian Americans, whites, and Latinos, say salaries are too low. And while majorities across age, education, and income groups say salaries are too low, younger Californians, or those aged 18 to 34, are more likely than those aged 35 and older to hold this view. Now, with most Californians thinking that teacher salaries are too low, how do they feel about their teachers striking for higher pay? Today, 6 in 10 Californians and 7 in 10 public school parents support their public school teachers striking for higher pay. While at least half across regions support striking, support is highest in Los Angeles, which is not too surprising given it's home to the nation's second largest and the state's largest school district. And they have recently went on strike for higher pay, a reduction of class sizes, and charter school regulations, among other things. Today, across parties, 8 in 10 Democrats, compared to about half of independents, and 4 in 10 Republicans support teachers striking for higher pay. And among racial and ethnic groups, nearly 8 in 10 African Americans support teacher strikes, followed by 7 in 10 Latinos, and about 6 in 10 Asian Americans, and just about half of whites. Support for teachers striking for higher pay decreases with rising age and income levels, while about 6 in 10 across education groups and among men and women support teachers striking for higher pay. So now moving on to 2 areas of concern. So the first will be immigration, and then the second will be school safety. So moving on to this issue of immigration, which is on the top of mind of many Californians as well as nationwide, we find that when it comes to concern about increased immigration enforcement efforts in local public schools, 6 in 10 Californians are concerned that increased enforcement efforts will impact undocumented students in their local public schools and their families. 7 in 10 public school parents say they're concerned as well. And across racial and ethnic groups, Latinos are the most likely to be very concerned compared to fewer Asian Americans, African Americans, and whites. Across partisans, Democrats are more than twice as likely as Republicans to say they are very confused, 41 to 15%. And only about 24% of independents say they are very concerned. Regionally, about 1 in 3 residents are very concerned in LA, the Bay Area, and the Inland Empire, while fewer elsewhere say the same. Now turning to another top concern, which is school safety. So when asked, how concerned are you about the threat of a mass shooting in your local schools, we find that 7 in 10 Californians are very or somewhat concerned. And that includes about 8 in 10 public school parents citing that they are concerned. Across parties, Democrats are somewhat more likely than independents and far more likely than Republicans to be very concerned. And across racial and ethnic groups, we find that Latinos are much more likely than African Americans, Asian Americans, and whites to say they are very concerned. Notably, the share of those saying they are very concerned decreases as educational attainment and income levels rise. And looking across the regions, we find that about 2 in 3 say they are concerned about the threat of a mass shooting, with residents in Los Angeles, with about half of them saying they are very concerned. So now we will look at California's funding and policy preferences when it comes to K-12 public education. So turning to funding for local public schools. So this slide here shows a time trend on our question regarding whether Californians think the current level of state funding for their local public schools is more than enough, just enough, or not enough. And as you can see here, in the last decade, the share of likely voters saying that state funding is not enough has hovered between 50 to 60%. And when looking back 10 years ago, 49% of likely voters said that state level of funding was not enough. And today we see a 10-point increase with 59% of likely voters saying this. A similar share of California adults and public school parents also note that the current level of state funding for their local public schools is not enough. Today, Democrats are more likely than independents and far more likely than Republicans to say their local schools do not get enough state funding. And across racial and ethnic groups, African Americans are the most likely to hold this view. And majorities across regions and demographic groups overall say that state funding is inadequate. Now, a ballot measure eligible for 2020, which would tax commercial properties according to their current market value, but would not lift the landmark Proposition 13's limits on residential property taxes, thus creating a split roll property tax system. And when asked about a potential state ballot measure that would make this change and would direct some of the new tax revenue to state funding for K through 12 public schools, we find that 56% of adults and 54% of likely voters say they would vote yes. Across partisans, Democrats are far more likely than independents and Republicans to say they would vote yes. And regionally, support varies from a high of 62% in the Bay Area to a low of 47% in Orange and San Diego. Across racial and ethnic groups, majorities of Latinos, African Americans, and Asian Americans say they would vote yes, compared to just under half of whites. Notably, renters are more likely than homeowners, and public school parents are more likely than all adults to say they would vote yes. And also noteworthy is that we asked in our January survey a very similar question. However, we did not mention directing revenue to any specific purpose. And we found in that survey that 47% of adults and 49% of likely voters were in favor of this general idea of having commercial properties taxed according to their current market values. So about a 9-point increase from what we're seeing today for adults and a 5-point increase for likely voters. Now turning to another proposal that is on the mind of state legislatures, which is the opportunity to lower the threshold needed to pass a parcel tax. Notably, there's an active bill, Senate Bill 5, which legislatures are moving forward with to establish 55% as the new majority. Now, when asked about a state ballot measure to replace the 2/3 vote requirement with a 55% majority, we find that 44% of adults and 39% of likely voters say they would vote yes, so notably below the threshold needed. Across partisans, a majority of Democrats would vote yes, compared to about 4 in 10 independents and 2 in 10 Republicans. Across racial and ethnic groups, support is highest among Latinos, coming in at about 58%, and lowest among whites at 34%. Across regions, a majority of residents in LA say they would vote yes, compared to 4 in 10 elsewhere. Now, in Governor Newsom's 2019-2020 proposed state budget, he proposes increased spending for early childhood and K through 12 education. In fact, all education levels receive significant funding increases, with about $58.7 billion in general fund expenditures dedicated for K through 12 education. So our survey looked at several specific policy proposals as it relates to K through 12 education. One of these includes his plan to allocate $3 billion in one-time spending to pay down unfunded liabilities in the California State Teachers Retirement System, CalSTRS. And as of May 2017, CalSTRS had an unfunded liability of $107 billion, so this will help start to chip away from that mountain. Now, after reading a brief description of this proposal, 58% of adults and 60% of likely voters support it. Across parties, Democrats are much more likely than independents and far more likely than Republicans to favor it. And at least half across regions support this proposal, with residents in the Bay Area the most likely to hold this view. Governor Newsom also proposes allocating $576 million to expand special education services and programs in school districts with high concentrations of special education students. And after reading a brief description of this proposal, 7 in 10 adults and likely voters are in favor. Notably, there is partisan agreement on this proposal, with majorities of Democrats, Independents, and Republicans supporting it. And more than 6 in 10 across regions and demographic groups are in favor. And notably, public school parents are more likely than adults overall to support this proposal, 82 to 70%. Now, turning to local bond and tax proposals, we find that a majority of adults and likely voters today say they would vote yes if their local school district had a bond measure on the ballot to pay for construction projects. Of note, local school bonds require a 55% majority to pass. And since we began asking this question, in 2015, the share of likely voters would vote yes has not dropped below 54%. Back to today, a majority of Democrats and independents would vote yes, compared to fewer Republicans, and majorities across regions would also vote yes. Now, turning to parcel taxes, most parcel taxes are under about $200 per year, and it usually includes an exemption for senior citizens. And local parcel taxes require a 2/3 majority to pass. An interesting analysis by EdSource recently found that from 2002 to 2018, 62% of proposed parcel taxes on the ballot passed. However, if that threshold for passage would have been lowered to 55%, 92% of the parcel taxes would have passed. So a little significant there. Now, today, 46% of adults and 44% of likely voters say they would vote yes on a local parcel tax to fund public schools, which again is below the current threshold. Across partisans, a majority of Democrats would vote yes, while fewer independents and Republicans would vote yes. Regionally, support is highest in the Bay Area, in the Inland Empire, followed by LA, the Bay Area, Orange, San Diego, and the Central Valley. Renters are also much more likely than homeowners to say they would vote yes. Now turning to another hot button issue, charter schools. So for those who are unaware, charter schools are a tuition-free, tax-funded public schools that have been typically given more flexibility and autonomy than district-operated schools. In California, most are run by nonprofit board of directors. Nationwide, there are over 7,000 charter schools, and in California, there are over 1,300, which serves about 10% of the public school student population. And when asked about the general knowledge about charter schools, 2 in 3 Californians say they have heard a lot or a little. Notably, 38% of public school parents say they have heard nothing at all about them. However, when asked about their support for charter schools, Californians are divided on whether they generally favor or oppose them. Public school parents are more likely to favor charters than adults overall. And across parties, Republicans and independents are much more likely than Democrats to support charter schools. Half of Latinos and whites are in favor, compared to fewer Asian Americans and African Americans when it comes to this. And majorities in the Inland Empire in Orange and San Diego, but fewer than half elsewhere are in favor of charter schools. So with Californians divided over their support for charters, we find that 2 in 3 say they are very or somewhat concerned about charter schools taking away state funding that is directed typically for traditional local public schools. Notably, 3 in 4 public school parents are very or somewhat concerned about this. And majorities across regions also express concern, with residents in Los Angeles the most likely to say they are concerned. Across parties, Democrats are much more likely than independents and Republicans to say they are very concerned. And across racial and ethnic groups, African Americans are the most likely to say they are very concerned, although majorities of other groups say they are at least somewhat concerned. Now, turning to LCFF, so 6 years after the local control funding formula was enacted, the share of Californians who've heard about it still remains low, with about 27% of adults saying they have heard either a lot or a little about the LCFF. 40% of public school parents have at least heard about the policy. But however, after reading a brief description about the local control funding formula, 2/3 of adults are in favor of the LCFF, while 77% of public school parents hold the same view. Across parties, 8 in 10 Democrats and 7 in 10 independents are in favor of LCFF, compared to about half of Republicans. Across racial and ethnic groups, Latinos and Asian Americans are the most likely to favor the LCFF, compared to fewer whites and African Americans. And notably, solid majorities across regions and across age, education, and income groups support the LCFF. Now, as the state implements the local control funding formula, 47% of adults and 60% of public school parents are confident that local school districts that receive additional funding will direct these funds to support English language learners and lower income students. Across partisans, 6 in 10 Democrats, 4 in 10 independents, and 1 in 3 Republicans are confident. Across racial and ethnic groups, 6 in 10 Latinos, compared to less than half in other groups, say they are confident. And regionally, residents of those in the Inland Empire are the most likely to be at least somewhat confident that these additional funds will be spent on programs for ELL and lower income students. Now, turning to early childhood education, which our governor has emphasized early on that early childhood should be a top priority for his administration. According to a national report that ranks all state-funded preschool programs, notably California ranked 14th in access to preschool for 4-year-olds. When asked about the importance of attending preschool to a student's success in kindergarten through 12th grade, nearly 8 in 10 adults say that attending school is important. Today, a solid majority of Democrats say preschool is important, very important, compared to fewer independents and Republicans. Regionally, those in Los Angeles are the most likely to hold this view, although majorities across regions say that it is at least somewhat important. Across racial and ethnic groups, Latinos are more likely than African Americans, Asian Americans, and whites to say preschool is very important. And notably, 88% of public school parents feel that preschool is important. So now that given Californians see attending preschool as important to a student's success, how do they feel about whether the state government should fund voluntary preschool programs for all 4-year-olds? In his first budget proposal, Governor Newsom proposed extending subsidized preschool to all low-income 4-year-olds over 3 years and eventually to all 4-year-olds, regardless of income. And in addition to Newsom's proposal, there are numerous bills introduced in the legislature to increase the quality and expand access to early education programs. Today, we find that a strong majority of adults and public school parents think that the state government should fund voluntary preschool. And regionally, Los Angeles residents are the most likely to say this, compared to about at least half elsewhere. Across partisans, Democrats are far more likely than independents and Republicans to say the state should fund preschool. And across racial and ethnic groups, 8 in 10 Latinos hold this view, compared to about half of other groups. Great, so let me just wrap up and bring up some key points, and then we can open it up for questions. So in conclusion, most Californians say that K-12 public education should be a high priority for the governor, but there are partisan divides on whether new policies are needed and which of those policies they are. Coming off the teacher strikes throughout the state, we find that many say that teacher salaries are too low, and more than half across regions support teachers striking for more pay. With 2020 on the mind of some Californians, solid majorities of likely voters favor a state bond and higher taxes on commercial properties to raise school revenues. However, lowering the local tax threshold receives less support. Californians have mixed views on charter schools. Most say it is important to have the option of a charter school, but many are concerned about the fiscal impacts on traditional local public schools. And finally, with the new administration's emphasis on early education, Californians see preschool as important for future educational success. And across regions, there is majority support for a state-funded preschool program for all 4-year-olds. Okay, so at this point, I'd like to open it up for questions, but please wait for a friendly PPIC staffer to come around with the mic. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Hi. So when we were reviewing the charter school data, you mentioned that close to about 40% of the public school parents are unaware of charter schools, but close to 75% of all public school parents are concerned about charter schools taking away money from traditional schools. Is there any cross data on between the two to see what percentage of those who are concerned about charter schools taking away money from public schools are actually not aware of what charter schools are? Or is there any data of that nature?
Yeah, that's a great question. Feel free after this that we can help link up and provide that data for you. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for the great report. I was doing an advocacy day a few weeks ago at the Capitol, and I saw this sea of shirts, and they all had to do with being for or against an issue with charter schools. And I was just wondering if you could comment on if there's more activism now, or I was just surprised at the number of people there.
Yeah, I mean, we were asking this survey, we asked a couple of questions on charter, which was pretty great, since normally we wouldn't have been able to go into that depth. But yeah, overall, it was striking that Californians are really divided on whether they favor or oppose it. And I think notably, Governor Newsom set out a charter school task force that's convening state leaders that will sort of report on coming in July, or they'll come back with a report on their assessment of charter schools in California. And I know there's been a lot of coverage about charter schools recently, and I know it's a very hot button issue. And I think it's sort of now becoming on the top of mind and more mainstream in a lot of news. So that may be a part of that.
Hi, in your last summary chart, you had a reference to voters supporting a statewide bond. But I don't recall seeing an individual slide on a state bond. I saw the local bonds one, but are we talking about a state school facilities bond?
Yeah, so actually we had like about 60 questions, which is about double the amount of questions we typically have in a survey. So not every question was afforded a slide, but we did ask about that, a local and a state bond as well. Yeah.
A follow-up question on that. On that question, was there a particular dollar amount that was asked, or was it a range, or was it just whether you support or not support a state bond?
Yeah, we did not put a specific dollar or willingness to pay. It was just a general favor or oppose.
Will you in the future be using this online system? And the second question is, no idea of dealing with your school districts to your charter school number-wise? Yeah, so to answer the second question, so charter school parents were included in our public school parent population or sample. Yes, together. And then in regards to future online methodology, that's something we're definitely looking into. But for now, we'll be using a combination of our telephone interviewing and online. Mm-hmm. Great.
Hi. I just had a question about when you're talking about bond offerings for new construction, was there any breakdown as far as what type of building is going to be done, such as sustainability issues and energy conservation, water conservation, those kinds of topics, as far as the new school is important, but also what type of school is important?
Yeah, well, yeah, I definitely appreciate that question, and maybe we'll sort of get onto that in our July environment survey, or sort of ask more environmentally focused. But yeah, overall, we just asked about school construction in general on this, not specifying any specific requirements or details on that.
It's just interesting that the one slide showed a clear majority thought that test scores were average or below average, but a majority also thought their school was doing an excellent or good job preparing their students for college. So I just wondered, how do you square those two?
Yeah, it's an interesting juxtaposition. We could definitely provide some crosstabs specifically looking into that for you. However, I think it's just the nature of each question and sort of what respondents, how they read that. Yeah.
Like the Congress question. Everybody needs Congress to be elected.
Yes, exactly. Yep. Great. Okay. If there are no more questions, everybody enjoy your rest of your Thursday.